So good afternoon from sunny Old Town Alexandria. We're right across the river from our nation's capital, and I want to welcome each of you to the panel session today on sustainable aviation, today and in the future. So I'm Ed Waggoner. I'm the Deputy Associate Administrator for Programs in NASA's Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate. And I'm truly honored to be part of Imagine Aviation and our conversation around sustainability, and in particular, sustainable aviation. I'm joined today by an absolutely stellar panel of experts in the area of sustainable aviation. Our panelists have expertise of such breadth and depth that it makes my job as the panel moderator a piece of cake. They are each internationally recognized experts in their respective fields, and all of our panelists are students of leadership. So let's get into this, and let me start by introducing our panel. So first, Dr. Jim Heilman. Jim is the Chief Scientific and Technical Advisor for Energy and Environment at the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. Next will be Dr. Jimmy Kenyon. He's the Director of the Advanced Air Vehicles Program at NASA's Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate and a dear colleague. Akbar Sultan. Akbar is a Director of Aerospace Operations and Safety Program in NASA's AR&D, and Akbar and I have been working together for many years now. And finally, batting cleanup today, Dr. Brian Yutko. Brian is now the Vice President and Chief Engineer for Sustainability and Future Mobility at the Boeing Corporation. So, I mean, this is just an incredible group of men to be with. So after our opening set of questions, which we're going to go in the same order as I just introduced folks, we'll get comments from each of the panelists. Then we're going to dig a little deeper in some of the issues and questions and concerns associated with sustainable aviation. So I've got some prepared questions, but we want to hear from you and what's on your mind. So please enter your questions and upvote other questions in the Conference IO app. And I think that's all of you have access to that. So we're going to start off with Jim. So Jim, in November of 2021, the FAA published the United States Aviation Climate Action Plan. Of course, this describes a whole of government approach to put the aviation sector on a path towards achieving net zero emissions by 2050. An incredible goal. So the plan builds on both individual and sector-wide commitments announced by the aviation industry and highlights some very specific actions and policy measures to foster innovation and to drive change across the entire aviation sector. Now, Jim, I know your fingerprints are all over this document. So would you take a few minutes and describe what the U.S. Aviation Climate Action Plan addresses, maybe some of the goals associated with the plan, and highlight some of the major areas of focus that are described in the plan?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I'm happy to do that. It's an honor to be here talking to everyone about it. So if you don't get anything else from what I'm saying, just remember to put in your search engine to Google Aviation Climate Action Plan or FAA Climate Action Plan, and you'll pull up the plan and it'll be there. And it really does, as Ed described, provide a whole of government approach to addressing climate change from aviation. And it's not something that came out of a vacuum. We've been working on this for years toward this type of thing. But it was with the new administration, there's a real strong push on this, and the president came out with a net zero economy-wide goal last year. And so we in the FAA worked closely with our colleagues at NASA, Department of Energy, USDA, and really started thinking about what it would take to get to aviation to be net zero. And this document captures that. So we went through and looked at historical trends, found that, today's fleet of aircraft is actually the most efficient way to get from any travel long distances in the US. We noticed that 97% of aviation emissions are associated with jet fuel. And we started thinking about, future direction of aviation, increased operations. Work closely with our colleagues at NASA to think about what could be done through technology and the Sustainable Flight National Partnership. and how critical it will be to get new generation of aircraft with a step change in environmental performance. The importance of operational procedures, because with increased operations, fuel efficiency could actually get worse. And the thing that we really learned with this effort is the importance of what you put in the tank. Jet fuel is an amazing thing, and we all take it for granted. But unfortunately, when you burn it, it emits CO2. So we've got to find a way to get rid of that CO2 impact. And sustainable aviation fuels really represents that opportunity. So a big part of this is the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Grand Challenge, where Department of Transportation, Energy, USDA, our partners at NASA, EPA, others, we're all working to scale up the deployment of these fuels to 3 billion gallons in 2030, and then to have sufficient fuel in place to replace all jet fuel uplift in the US by 2050, or 35 billion gallons. And Ed, I could talk about this forever, but I don't think that'd be quite the right approach for this panel. So I'll go back to listening mode.
Okay, great, Jim. And we'll come back to some of that. There's no doubt about that. So we know that the evolution of our modern and efficient airframes and propulsion systems, this historically has produced some of the most significant aviation emission reductions. So Jimmy, I'd like to ask you that just to take a few minutes, talk about some of the activities that NASA has undertaken to address aviation sustainability from a vehicle technology perspective.
Thanks, Ed. You're absolutely right. The vehicle makes a big difference, and here at NASA, we've either launched or in the midst of launching a number of very focused technology development efforts targeting improving the efficiency of aircraft under the banner of the Sustainable Flight National Partnership that Jim just mentioned. The goal of this effort overall is to reduce the risk and mature these technologies, getting them into industry's design space in a time frame that allows them to put them into the market, to get them into the next generation of product family that we anticipate will come to market sometime in the 2030s. The effort's really born out of more than a decade of NASA research, through which we've identified really 4 key technologies that represent best in class and the best opportunity to make an impact on aircraft efficiency. These 4 technologies also represent all of the ways that you can improve an aircraft in terms of efficiencies: aerodynamic efficiency, reducing drag; it's propulsion efficiency; it's reducing weight. And so if you don't mind me just kind of going through those very quickly, looking at aerodynamic efficiency, we're looking at very efficient wing technologies, very high aspect ratio, long slender wings. The iconic example is the transonic truss brace wing. And we've got a focused activity in one of our projects, the Advanced Air Transport Technology Project, that's looking at sort of the edge of the envelope, the hard problems: buffet, stall, high lift system integration, among others. In parallel with that, we're also launching a new activity called the Sustainable Flight Demonstrator, which is going to look at advanced aero configurations, very efficient aero configurations, and take one of those to flight so that we can really mature that technology in a relevant environment for flight. On the airframe side, we also know that they need to be lighter. And so a key way to do that is composite structures, but there are challenges. And the biggest challenge today is, how do you manufacture those at a rate that can get into the market so that we can take advantage of the weight savings? And so we've just launched a new project called the High Rate Composite Aircraft Manufacturing, or HiCAM project, that's targeting just that, the manufacturing rate for large composite structures. On the propulsion side, we're going after small bore gas turbines. If we can reduce the size of the core and push the efficiency up, then we can get a huge benefit, not just from the efficiency of the core, but from opening more real estate so that you can integrate these with your airplane, get more bypass ratio for more efficiency, and not make your engine bigger, heavier, and more draggy. So we've just launched our Hybrid Thermally Efficient Core, or HiTech project, to do that. And a couple of other key things about that HiTech project. One effort within that is looking at the combustors to make sure that they can operate on up to 100% sustainable aviation fuels. Looking back at what Jim had just mentioned about those, well, we got to make sure that the engines can operate on those fuels so we can take advantage of them. We're also looking at high levels of electrical power extraction, so we can take electricity off of the engine and use that in a hybrid architecture, a more electric architecture. And that brings me to the fourth technology area, which is electrified aircraft propulsion. If we can introduce high power or high levels of electrical power, we can do all sorts of things. We can better optimize our engine. We can redesign the engine so that it's smaller and lighter and take advantage of electricity. Or we can think of innovative architectures like distributed electric propulsion. So it's a real game changer. And we have a couple of activities there. One is a focused activity in our advanced air transport technology project, looking at architectures and high power components. But we also just launched an electrified powertrain flight demonstration project, which is going to take a couple of these concepts and deal with the hard problems of integration and get those to flight. And so we've got a lot of exciting work, and this work is incredibly important because improving aircraft efficiency means we reduce the fuel burn needed. If we reduce the fuel burn, we reduce emissions in an absolute sense. And then the other thing we do by reducing the fuel burn is we make the problems associated with scaling up alternative energy production, sustainable aviation fuel production, a little bit easier by needing a little bit less of it. So it's really an important effort, but we're excited, and we think we have an opportunity to make a huge impact through this effort.
Okay, great, Jimmy. So you thumbnail sketch there 4 key technologies that you're looking at from a vehicle and propulsion perspective. Now, something that often is not well understood by even the general flying public is the emission efficiencies that can be gained through operations, how we're actually operating in the airspace. And of course, this helps reduce fuel burn, it helps reduce emissions from aviation. As a matter of fact, in the climate action plan that Jim talked about earlier, that's one of the specifically highlighted areas, operational improvements in the action plan. So Akbar, from your perspective, within the program and the knowledge that you have of other activities going on in ARMD, talk a little bit about what you're doing relative to operations and safety that will impact sustainable aviation.
Well, thank you, Ed. I mean, essentially, it's to develop both ground-based and flight deck capabilities to reduce noise, emissions, fuel, and contrails for the operations of these vehicles. And the one thing about from the operational perspective that you can get efficiencies is you can try to address both legacy and new vehicles. So if we're able to optimize and work at system level efficiency and say, okay, how do we optimize the entire system such that all vehicles operate at their most efficient profile, we're able to essentially eke out, for lack of a better word, operational efficiencies. I mean, if you just think about it, if you're able to shave off, 1 minute per flight, and of course you can shave off more than that, but these numbers add up. In each one of those additional minutes is an additional, levels of CO2, noise, and everything else that's generated. So being able to essentially reduce that is how you get the additional operational efficiencies. And as we start looking at these new vehicles that we're introducing, and really excited to be, working together with Jimmy to ensure that we're able to, accommodate his new vehicles, is to make sure that we allow them to operate at their most optimal profile. Because, if you look at, current system, I mean, we have, we still have a few MD-80s operating, and we have 787s, and we have the future, concepts coming online that Jimmy's working on. If we ask all these vehicles to say, operate at the least common denominator, which is an MD-80, you can see you'll have a problem. So therefore, we're trying to say, let each vehicle operate at its most optimal profile. Now, we have done considerable amount of work up to here. And I mean, if you look at the history of the ARMD operations and safety program, we have done all the ATDs, and we've developed quite a bit of safety capabilities and technologies, both for the airspace as well as the flight deck capabilities. But we want to build upon that, because the capabilities we've developed to now has been looking at incremental flight segments, arrivals, departures, all en route airspace. So going forward, we're looking at regional and NAS-wide optimization. How can you optimize the entire flight profile and trajectory, taking into account also pre and post-flight events? And given that, we essentially want to embark on a series of demonstration projects with FAA and our manufacturers, as well as the airline industry and the avionics manufacturers, to sort of demonstrate these efficient capabilities, starting with the demonstration of departure scheduling with post-departure events taken into account, for instance, the upstream events for a major airport, starting next year, and building upon that, each consecutive year to build it up to a dense, multi-metroplex environment, doing oceanic operations, inter-ANSP transitions between handoffs between ANSPs, disruption management in being able to do recovery operations, and of course, building it up to integrated flight deck capabilities and in the connected flight deck environment. So essentially, it's to, at the end of the day, we want to be able to look at the entire gate-to-gate operational perspective to enable each and every vehicle to operate at its most optimal profile rather than sort of forcing everybody to operate at the least common denominator.
Very interesting, Akbar. It does sound like when you talk about optimal profiles, this is a real multi-dimensional, heterogeneous optimization problem that you're dealing with. So that's formidable for sure. Okay, so we've heard from the regulatory community and a little bit about policy. We've heard from the research community, but that's not really where the rubber hits the road. So let's see, Brian, share some insights on how Boeing plans to address aviation sustainability by, one, assessing potential technologies and then getting them into the marketplace. I mean, that's what's going to make the difference.
All right, we'll talk about where the rubber hits the runway, I guess, is maybe to continue the analogy there, Ed. So I just to maybe set the stage for how I think about it, how we think about this is decarbonizing the economy and eliminating the climate impacts from all the industries that are surrounding us, while maintaining our way of life and supporting the improvements in the ascending world in countries all around the globe, is probably the most exciting technology and engineering challenge of a generation, or maybe two. It might take two or so. And so, as I look around that, I just see, just for engineers that are starting to come into the aerospace community, this is just an unbelievably exciting time to make new products, new technologies that are really going to, Ed, to your point, that are really going to find their way into real use and solve that challenge. So, so I'm an engineer, so I like to kind of think logically about this. And so I would say kind of three things to think about. One is, where are the emissions? Two is, where are the technology problems to go solve for? And then three is probably actually a bit of where the, what I would call business physics to go solve for, which is actually, we were talking about with Akbar, the kind of multi-stakeholder problem there, which is both technology and non-technology, both of which are important. And so, where are the emissions? If you look at actually where aviation emissions occur, Jim referenced, 97% in the aviation industry come from in-flight, use of jet fuel. If you look at where that jet fuel is consumed, about half of flights in the global air transportation network are at or below 1,000 kilometers. And so 1,000 kilometers, if you think about, that's kind of a relatively, let's call it short range mission, 620 miles in the US, if you're US centric, DC to Chicago, maybe a flight to think about. You could sort of imagine over, let's say, decades, thinking about how might we start to electrify flights in that domain. It's very, very aggressive to get up to 1,000 kilometers, but just using that as kind of a marker in the road. Those only represent 15% of the total emissions. So 85% of the emissions actually come from flights that are over 1,000 kilometers. And so we won't be able to fully electrify those. And so that's where we have to start thinking about these two sort of sides of the coin, which have both been mentioned now: efficiency and changing the energy that's used on board the airplane. And so as we have crafted our strategies, we've kind of aligned everything under 4 strategies. And this is really how we're kind of marching the whole business along now, which is 1, fleet renewal. And fleet renewal is what it means. It means that we have technologies that exist today in companies like Boeing and Airbus and others around the globe. No new technology development, just sort of fleet renewal in the actual operational fleet. How much of a carrot is there by increasing the efficiency of the operational fleet is actually pretty large. So it's somewhere around 20 to 30%, which can be quite significant. And airlines coming out of the pandemic are actually doing a tremendous job of renewing their fleets and of making their fleets more efficient over time. Two is operational efficiencies. So Akbar just covered this extremely well. We know that there's a carrot in there from optimal cruise speed and altitudes, optimal lateral tracks. There's both technology and non-technology problems in there to solve for, and so we have R&D projects and products through our global services business that are attempting to solve for that. The second bit here, the third pillar strategy here is related to advanced technologies. And so these are what I would consider to be kind of traditional Breguet-like technologies. So improvements in aerodynamics, propulsion, structures. They are immense to be able to launch a new product that has an efficiency improvement over a previous generation that's somewhere around 15 or 20% better than the generation that preceded it. And so the way that you get those 15 or 20% better efficiency improvements is you stack up a lot of technologies in all of those different domains. A lot of things that actually Jimmy mentioned there, composites, propulsion systems, configurations. So if you're thinking about, we might have our first configuration change in decades. Really since the 367-80, which is my favorite airplane. And so we might see things like transonic thrust brace wings enter the air transportation system in the decade ahead. And so the Sustainable Flight National Partnership is a really important program to that effect. And then the fourth strategy is related to energy transition writ large. So sustainable fuels, obviously, our biggest lever in both the near and the medium term to actually be able to meet our commitments by 2050. I'll talk in a second just briefly about things like electric and some of the other things we're working on, but under any of the most aggressive scenarios of the uptake of those kinds of systems, we know that we need to 1,000x our production of sustainable fuels if we want to meet our commitments. We just know that as a fact. And so really enabling both the removing the barriers on the airplane technology side. So we've said we're going to make our airplanes compatible with 100% sustainable fuels by 2030. But it's not just the airplanes; it's all the fuel infrastructure. It's where are we getting the fuels from? It's on the production side. There's a whole large topic there, but this is just critically important to meeting our commitments by 2050. We've started to work on battery electric airplanes. We have a joint venture called Whisk, which is intriguing both from the fact that these are zero emissions airplanes at the source, and but we can start to bring flight closer to where people live, and that's a very intriguing kind of value proposition. It's an autonomous aircraft, which we can get into. We're working with GE and NASA on a program called Electric Powertrain Flight Demonstrator, where we're working on high power systems. So if you think about scaling electrification up, which Jimmy talked about, how do you get to high power in terms of multi-megawatt, high voltage, multi-kilovolt systems? And we've even recently completed with DARPA and NASA technology tests related to hydrogen storage systems. So we've done some sort of dual use R&D programs related to space systems, and recently tested a tank in a NASA facility to learn more about that technology. And so we could talk a bit more about that. The last thing I'll say and just hand it back over is, this is all about full life cycle. So we need to look at the full life cycle of where the energy comes from, how it gets on the airplane. And we also need to look at CO2 and non-CO2 effects to make sure that we're really thinking holistically about the climate challenge problem.
Terrific, Brian. Thank you. So we've got a few questions in on the conference IO, but I want to follow up. I'm going to first follow up with Jim from an international perspective. So I know that as you guys were putting out, it's a U.S. plan, but I know that you were thinking about ICAO. You were thinking about how this is going to be received internationally. Maybe even doing some backdoor diplomacy relative to what the palatability of some of the things that you talk about are. So could you share any of that with us just from an international perspective and what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the climate action plan that I mentioned actually as a formal matter is a submission to ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And all states are encouraged to submit those every 3 years. But right now in ICAO, there's actually an interesting discussion that's going on, and it's centered around something that, because we're in aviation, we love acronyms. It's called the LTAG. But what that is it's the long-term aspirational goal for international CO2 emissions. So you can imagine why we started saying LTAG a lot as opposed to long-term aspirational goal, yada, yada, yada. But the reason this is important is that international aviation is agreed that the regulations for safety, airworthiness, operational compatibility, everything is negotiated out of ICAO because we need to be able to fly aircraft from one country and land them in another. And, you know, for example, the aircraft that Boeing are manufacturing need to be able to be operated everywhere in the world. So we have common standards that way. And so there's been a lot of discussion around this idea of a long-term goal and how do we get there. We've been doing a lot of work to support that. And a lot of the things that you hear about, you know, us here talking domestically apply there as well. We have to improve operational efficiency. We have to have those new, more fuel efficient aircraft, and sustainable aviation fuels are really key. And so when you start though talking to other nations about where we need to go, everybody's in agreement that climate is a challenge. Climate needs to be dealt with. The concern you run into though is one of cost. And Brian hit it well, that there's parts of the world that, you know, aspire to have the same level of economic development that we have. And they get concerned when they start seeing things being really expensive. So I would say, Brian, that the challenge for this generation of engineers coming in is to think about how to do this, how to develop these low carbon technologies. How do we decouple our economy from creating carbon, but do so in a way that enables all boats to be lifted around the world? Because everybody wants to get there, but there's a lot of concern, especially from developing parts of the world, about how much it could cost to get there. But I can guarantee you, we've got a lot of willing partners that want to get to net zero with us as soon as possible.
Very, very interesting, Jim. Thanks for that perspective. I love that. There's so many things. I've got my notes. I've got the conference IO going on here. I'm going to kind of throw this out. This is probably sort of a policy thing, but it's the question with the most upvotes right now in the conference IO. So does the current cost of an airline ticket truly reflect the emissions impact of that trip on future generations? And if not, should NASA or the FAA advocate raising ticket prices now to make sure that the true cost is being paid by current passengers? I know this is a very intense policy question and debate, and we're just talking opinions here. That's all that it is. But Jim, I'm going to start with you and just ask, was this something that came up during your during negotiations as you were putting together your plan?
It didn't come up in the development of the plan, but it's something that's just well understood. And it's the short of it is it's the tragedy of the commons, where we all have certain things that we share, and then we all pollute in them until there's a problem. And nobody worries about that pollution until there's a problem. And yes, there are economic damages associated with the pollutants that come out of the tailpipe, and they're not priced right now. For the most part, you could have a discussion about, you know, how they should be priced or whatnot, but the simple fact is they are not priced. And if they are to be priced, then FAA is a regulatory body. Obviously, we would have to have, you know, the congressional direction to do that. Yeah. And without that, we you know, regulate for safety, and we do certain things for noise and emissions and fuel economy for airworthiness, but you have to have the regulatory authority to do so.
Yeah, good good insights, and that's the key thing. I mean, yeah, this might make sense, but you still have to have the authority to do that. I'm going to go back to something that that Brian brought up, and he talked about advanced technologies, advanced configurations. I'm going to start with Jim, and then I think Brian might want to jump in from an assessment point of view. So I'm going to start with Jimmy. So Jimmy, talk a little bit about. We've done work at NASA on blended wing bodies and transonic truss brace wings, and but now we're looking at, okay, how are we going to get something to the marketplace? How are we going to partner up to do that? So could you talk a little bit about that, share some of the thoughts?
Sure, and it's a challenging problem. When you go to the airport and you go up to the gate, you have a certain expectation what you're going to see out the window there, and am I going to get on that airplane? But there's also, and it's bigger than just that, which is a perception problem with the customers. It's a risk challenge with industry that I know Brian can talk a lot more to, because industry has to be able to sell these things. But that's where NASA can play a role. And our ability, and it's kind of like Simon was talking about earlier, as a government agency, we're not tied to that do or die, I have to sell this product. We can lean forward and take some risks. We can take some chances. Our job at NASA is to learn. And by learning, we can tear down and burn down some of that risk that's out there so that we can actually encourage industry or enable industry to lean a little bit more forward and lean a little bit farther into it than they might be able to convince their boards to invest in as they're looking at future products. And so that's really our role. And Brian teed it up. We've been flying tubes and wings forever. And so if we're going to look at genuinely different kinds of architectures, that's going to require some risk burn down. That's going to require some thinking, because we are breaking a cycle, we are breaking an architecture and doing something different than has been done for decades. And so that's where NASA can invest. We can take on some of that risk, and we can work with industry as we take on to some of that risk to make sure that we understand the hard problems, we understand how to solve some of the hard problems, so that when industry takes these things on into their product cycles, it's something that is more viable, or at least comes across as being more viable because it is more understood. You fear what you don't understand, and we've got to get past that point. And that's where NASA has a key role.
And Jimmy, that is great. Brian, I just want to tee this up just a little bit for you. I know that you've got comments, but particularly from a risk point of view, as you're thinking about a new technology or maybe a new manufacturing technique or something like that, because the rate of manufacturing, if you're talking about something that is going to compete with a 737, that kind of rate of rolling off the end of the line every month. Talk a little bit about how Boeing can make those assessments, or the criticality of getting it right, and how you do those assessments from a technology or new configuration point of view.
Yeah, well, I'll say kind of the headline up front, and then I'll circle back, which is, the thing that's exciting about the transonic truss brace wing is a configuration is that it's legitimately a candidate for a 737 replacement in the sort of near and midterm, and that's really exciting. And that's, by the way, we've come a long way as an industry to be able to say that sort of authoritatively. So that's one thing. And now just to circle back on the question from a risk standpoint, I mean, as somebody who's been on this journey, for a while with NASA and with the FAA, I think NASA and the FAA have already been successful in pioneering and developing a lot of the technologies that have winnowed their way down to what could potentially be a commercially successful sort of step change in product configurations. NASA, going back to 2008 in the N+3 program, we've been looking at things like boundary layer ingestion, which is something that I spent a lot of time, researching myself. Things like blended wings, even prior to 2008. So there have just been a tremendous amount of work that that NASA has done in wind tunnels, in studies, which is now available to the world, as part of published reports and those things. And so to me, that is the moving the state of the art forward. And then so, taking my researcher cap off for a second, and from a Boeing perspective, these What we're looking for always with respect to efficiency is getting that 15 to 25% per generation. As we've kind of pressed on the tube and wing configuration, obviously those get harder and harder to extract out of that platform, if you will. And so, the numbers of technologies that stack up on one generation continue to increase, because any one will be kind of small in contribution. And so at some point we'll reach that threshold where we say, boy, we need to change the configuration to get the next step. And we're in that zone where it starts to become a legitimate thought. Now, the way I would answer your question, Ed, with respect to what gets it sort of over the edge, is a lot of it comes down to the ilities, producibility, reliability, fitting into the airport ability. So I don't know what you call that one, but very seriously, there are trillions of dollars of infrastructure, capital infrastructure around the globe, and we'd like to be able to fit into that relatively seamlessly, so that the uptake of these of new products can be quick and doesn't rely on having to do $2 trillion worth of updates to airports and those kinds of things. So those are all things that we think about, and through those lenses, the TTBW looks like a really serious candidate for a future product.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. So, okay, Akbar. So we've talked about this, and so new technologies, maybe different configurations that may not be comfortable operating at the Mach numbers that our vehicles are operating at right now in the airspace. From a safety perspective, share with us a little bit about how, one, the work you do and how you work with the FAA relative to just the safety aspect of changes in operation and things like that.
So thank you, Ed. So I mean, this is essentially a good segue along the risks and everything else that both Brian and Jimmy just pointed out. Because when you look from the safety perspective, it's in two realms. One is from the airline operation or center perspective, right? How do you do the safety management system or the in-time aviation safety management system of the entire realm of the aviation operation? And the second one is the vehicle itself, the flight deck technologies. So let me take the second one first. So as we develop these new vehicles and capabilities, I think we can all agree that we need new advanced flight decks. We can't take a 737 MAX cockpit, plop it into the new truss-based wing configuration and say, everything will be okay. These new vehicles will need advanced capabilities to help the cockpit and the pilot for integrated vehicle health management systems, for upset recovery, for maintenance of safe flight, because they have different wing loadings, different aerodynamics, and especially if we start looking at even more advanced configurations of hybrid electrics or all-electric configurations, where the response time, the human response time being able to deal with an off-nominal condition is just not fast enough, right? So therefore, you need higher levels of automation to be able to keep a safe flight profile, or you have to bring the flight engineer back. And I don't think that's a viable option. So that's essentially from the vehicle perspective that we're really looking at it as well to say, okay, how do we develop the future vehicle safety systems and everything? And then looking at it from the the airline operation center perspective and the SMS. Currently we have a safety management system that's been envy of the world. And everybody's been even copying it. As a matter of fact, we even have an ASIAS and CAST that, as a matter of fact, I may even say that Europeans are just trying to start it, and they don't even have an active ASIAS or a CAST equivalent. So we are, leading the world, and that's led the United States to have the safest aviation system in the world. However, the current system, we still are looking at a more post-flight, sort of a diagnostic environment. So given the future construct, we want to move towards a prognostic environment. How are you able to, using automation, identify precursors to potential events, and then also automatically mitigate them? Because right now, I think we have done a pretty good job of identifying post-flight events. In the current research that we have right now, we're able to identify and propose solutions to potential real-time events or in-time events, because some things, doesn't have to be real-time. But we really are trying to move towards the automated mitigation as well, because the mitigation in the current environment is still left up to the human. And given the future capabilities that's coming up the line, the human response time is just not going to be enough, both in terms of speed as well as the, look at the complexity of the systems and everything else as well. So this is where the additional automation is needed. And of course, as you look at that safety element of the vehicle system and the aviation system performance, I said the word auto a lot. So that means now you have to start looking at the V&V of this new automation system. So as you can see, it's sort of like it's a cascading, multi-pronged effort that we're leading here within NASA to say, okay, how do we build the vehicle system itself? How do we make sure that it's able to operate? How do we make sure it's safe? And then how do we make sure that the system automation and autonomy can actually be economically developed, deployed, and certified as well? So it's sort of like a very, multi-pronged effort that needs to be looked at.
Oh, excellent, Akbar. And I know that I don't want to go off on this tangent, but you have mentioned V before, and you kind of throw that out there and people hear it, but that's a huge expense relative to new software and new capabilities like you're talking about as well. So we won't explore that today, but that is something that you have certainly raised my awareness about. So I'm going to go over to the conference IO. The kind of top upvoted question right now, and I'm going to expand it a little bit, but here's the question. How does noise fit into sustainability, and how does the Cape 12 work plan for an independent noise / CO2 regulation work? But let's go just beyond just noise, other aspects. NOx, things like that. All of that works together, I would think, relative to sustainability. Jimmy, let me just start with you, and then anybody else that wants to jump in and offer an opinion or share some factoids, certainly do. So, Jimmy?
It's an important question, and I want to start with the other emissions besides, and I'll use air quotes, just CO2. Obviously, CO2, carbon dioxide, is a big deal, and that's where a lot of the focus is when we talk about the greening of aviation and sustainability. But let's be really clear. There are other emissions forms, the oxides of nitrogen, the NOx, as well as contrails and contrail-induced cloudiness that have what we call radiative forcing, but it's effectively very similar effects in terms of global warming, in terms of climate change, as carbon. The life cycle in the atmosphere is shorter for those other emission types, but when you're producing them every day, the impact is there. And so there's more than, if we really want to go about sustainability, we have to address more than just, again, air quotes, carbon dioxide. We've got to go after these other effects. One of the challenges there, though, is that we don't understand them as well. And so there's got to be some work done, and Jim's the wicked smart guy on this one, so he can talk a lot more intelligently about it than I can. But there is some work that we need to do in terms of understanding those impacts, understanding what causes them, how to predict them, and how to manage or avoid them, including things like the work Akbar's doing. Can we fly at different trajectories and altitudes? Maybe we lose a little bit on the efficiency, but we gain a whole lot in terms of contrails. How do you make that multidisciplinary or that multi-factor optimization? We have to understand a lot better to do that. Now you throw in noise, and noise is a little different because it's not an emission. Well, it is an emission, but it's a different kind of emission. It's not a gaseous emission. It's an acoustic emission, and now I'm getting, but that's okay. At any rate, we do know that noise is a huge barrier to the growth in the aviation system. And again, Jim's at the forefront of this. They hear the complaints, but we have to look at and consider the impact that noise is going to have on people. And it's more than just annoyance. It really does have physiological and psychological effects if there's too much of it. So first, do no harm. We have to figure out ways to work through the sustainability challenge when we talk about emissions and climate, without making noise worse. And then what can we do to make it better? Some of the challenges we have, though, is as we look at some of the technologies, new configurations being the prime example, our understanding of what exactly they do and how to mitigate is probably not as good as it is with some of the more established configurations. So one of the things we're doing within our Advanced Air Transport Technology project, we mentioned that we're working on this focused effort with transonic truss brace wing technology, is we're also going to go into our wind tunnels, which have acoustic measurement capability, and characterize the noise. If we characterize the noise, we understand the noise, then we can look at sources and we can look at mitigations as part of the overall technology development effort. But before we start mitigating, we have to understand what we're mitigating. And so that characterization of that acoustic signature, that noise coming from that configuration, is something that we're going about within that technology development activity.
Okay.
I mean, if I may, I want to jump on a couple of examples. That two common questions that I always get when it comes to noise. One is, folks asking, why do you guys have these aircraft spool up their engines on landing right over my house? And the response is, no, the aircraft does not spool up its engines on landings. That's what you hear is the slats, the flaps, the landing gear getting deployed, especially that whooping sound that you hear. So therefore, I mean, if you look at that aircraft and you're saying that you have to deploy those devices because you're trying to shed altitude or shed speed, but that altitude and speed was already, as a potential energy or kinetic energy gained by burning fuel, right? So why do you now have to forcefully shed it? Can you have an optimal profile descent and a trajectory so that you don't have to waste that original fuel that you burned to get this kinetic or potential energy, right? So that's essentially how you get sustainable operations. The second noise example that, for example, we get, and this is like Jimmy pointed out, is it's an emission. It has characteristics and it transports. For example, our folks here in Georgetown, and Jim, of course, knows this. They always say, put the aircraft over the Potomac on the DCA approach, right? Well, the noise carries by wind. So if the wind is blowing north and you put the aircraft over the Potomac, Georgetown is going to get 100% of the noise, not the Potomac River. It's going to be nice and quiet on the river for the canoers because the noise doesn't drop vertically down. It gets carried by wind. So these are all atmospheric things that we really need to take into account to make sure that it is indeed, we use science to address noise and emissions rather than just, sort of thinking about saying that it's all vertical or for that matter, different behavior.
Yep. Okay, what I want to do, I got a couple of more questions that I would like to get to. So let's talk about alternative fuels. Let's talk about sustainable aviation fuel, maybe hydrogen. Jimmy's talked a little bit about electrification, and Brian too on hybrid. So Jim Hallman, I'm going to start with you on this because this is one of the key tenets in the plan, particularly sustainable aviation fuels. So I'm going to start with you on this.
Yeah, this is a question that I get a lot. We've been thinking about this for quite a while. When we talk about sustainable aviation fuels, it's important to know what we're talking about. We're actually talking about hydrocarbon fuels. So if you're the guy who uploads the fuel at the airport, you don't know that there's any difference between the sustainable aviation fuel and the jet fuel we use today from petroleum. It's the same hydrocarbons. And the difference is where the fuel comes from. And because it's where the fuel comes from, the difference in the life cycle emissions, or the difference in the emissions, is not from the combustion. It's still producing CO2 when you burn it. It's because of where it came from. And so what we have to do then is a rigorous life cycle accounting, such that we know that the biomass, the crops, whatever it is, the waste material that went to make the fuel actually is providing an overall CO2 reduction. And I know that's hard for people to understand because they want the easy answer. If I had a Tesla and I plugged it in, well, of course it's not making any pollution. But guess what? If you happen to be in an area where all your electricity is coming from coal, you actually would be better off burning gasoline. Now, that's not to say in the long run it's not better, because it is, but it's important to understand where your energy actually comes from. So when people talk about hydrogen, got bad news. There are no hydrogen trees. It's just they don't exist. So the fuel has to come from somewhere. So if you want to know the benefit of something, you have to consider the full life cycle of it. And the other thing that's really important about sustainable aviation fuels, this gets back to what the Akbar said. Our airspace has to accommodate the oldest aircraft that want to use it, as well as the newest. And the beautiful thing about sustainable aviation fuels, they work with the oldest aircraft and they work with the newest. The Air Force has tested B-52s on it and certified them. Thank God all of our aircraft are newer than that. But that's the key, is you get to keep the $2 trillion or however many trillion of rolling flying stock we have, but we get to work the carbon that way. And so that's why we're focusing on this. And my last nugget on this one, there are a lot of challenges to hydrogen, but you know, some of the airframers think it could be brought on in the small aircraft at 2035. As much as I love small aircraft, as Brian noted, that's not going to make the difference. We need to decarbonize by 2050. And that means we have to do it with today's fleet of aircraft. So I welcome other people's thoughts on this, and I could definitely go off forever on this one.
That is an excellent point. That's an excellent point that we, you know, at NASA, certainly we are focusing on. Brian, I want to come back to you on this, and from, you know, sustainable aviation fuels, from production, distribution, hydrogen, what it would really take. You know, even strategically, if we're talking about something in the 2050s, you know, well, you know, just share some thoughts on that, if you would.
Well, a couple things is, you know, we of course want to deeply understand the technology that's involved, and so I could talk a bit about, you know, what does a hydrogen airplane mean from some of the, you know, we've done flight testing experiments in the past, and I mentioned we recently just did a large scale test of a tank. So I could talk about what it means from a technology standpoint, because we're still sort of actively exploring and on this journey to really understand, you know, what does that mean, and what's the art of the possible? Can they be made safe? You know, those sorts of things. But coming back just for a second, I totally agree with what Jim just said. It's for us, it's really about kind of, when we're speaking about this, it's really about keeping the opportunities in proportion to one another. And so as I look at if you think about the fleet in 2050, the airplanes that we're producing today, many of them will be flying at that time. And so the question is not hydrogen or not, it's you know, we clearly need sustainable fuels for those. And so, you know, and so that's point one, and not all sustainable fuels are created equal. So from a life cycle standpoint, you know, what feedstocks are being used, what's the conversion technology that's used to transform them, as Jim mentioned. I think about it as like an energy API for the airplane. You think, you know, I could take feedstocks from all around the world. They can be you know, municipal solid waste or forestry waste or agriculture waste that may be sort of resident in a certain region. I have these technologies that I'm able to convert it through certain pathways to be able to put them on any airplane in the world. So it's like an energy API. And I think that's really interesting, because as we start to scale sustainable fuels, different regions will have different feedstocks available to them, and will be able to become producers and contributors to the energy system for air transportation system. So that's really intriguing. As it relates to hydrogen, as Jim noted, you know, the first thing that we have to think about is we always need to be thinking about life cycle for any change in the energy that we're putting on board the airplane. We need to be thinking about life cycle, and we need to be thinking about CO2 and non-CO2 effects. So from a life cycle standpoint, with respect to hydrogen, right now the challenge is having what's called green hydrogen, or what I think about as low carbon hydrogen. So we have to, it's not naturally occurring in nature, so we need to separate it from other compounds like water. And separating it, we should ideally be using renewable energy to separate it, to then use it somehow. It turns out that we can use it as part of sustainable fuels as well, to increase the uptake of certain pathways. So we could take, if we had green hydrogen, we could take it and use it in sustainable fuels to increase some of the conversion efficiency. But if we decide we're to use it on airplanes, just as an example, so we're starting, you know, we've done a lot of flight test experimentation on this, and design studies, and we know that of course the challenge with using hydrogen on board an aircraft is that it's very energy dense by weight, but not by volume. And typically when you integrate those very large tanks into the aircraft, the energy per seat mile actually goes up. So the carrot is that you largely have water vapor as an emission. The sort of the downside is that the energy that is used to transport a person over a mile goes up because the airplane becomes a lot bigger and there are significant integration effects. There are also significant effects related to how do you certify them and how to use and store cryogenic fuels at airports and a whole bunch of other things. So it's a deep subject. We continue to sort of try to stay on the frontier of the technology as it's related there, but all these sort of life cycle and non-CO2 things are very important for us as we just think about overall how it all fits in.
Oh, that's great, Brian. Just looking at the time, so this is what we're going to do to finish up. We're going to do a lightning round. Try to keep your comments to about a minute and focus on things that you want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to hear and that you would feel badly about if you finished up the panel without making those kind of comments. So I'm going to go in the same order that you were introduced. So I'm going to start with Jim.
Wow, that's a tough one. So two things. First is if you want to know more about what we're doing with climate, Google FAA Climate Action Plan. Two, we actually put out a detailed FRN on all the things noise. Noise is critical. We got to address noise too. And I will say, I've actually been able to think through the space of how to develop a climate action plan to get to net zero. I can't think of a way to do the same for noise. And that speaks volumes about how hard noise is. And I would just thank you for the opportunity. And I would encourage everyone, work this problem hard. It is the problem of our generation, and we need all hands on deck.
Oh, that's beautiful, Jim. That really is. Jimmy?
Sure, and I think we've heard allusions to my thoughts on this exactly as we've gone through. The key here to being successful is to not get caught up in what you see in this magazine or that advertisement or that announcement. The key here is to have an honest conversation about what can really be done. When you look at it, we have to consider the overall effects from well to wake, not just how much you emit out the back end of your airplane, but where did that energy source come from? And where is it going when it's done? If we don't understand those very well, then we may think we're making the problem better while we're actually making it much, much worse. It's that honest conversation and a long-term commitment to that honest conversation and innovation needed to make it about that's going to make the difference here. I think we're at a unique point in time where we can do that. We can do that in a way that is globally sustainable, economically viable, and it's an exciting time to be in aviation for exactly that reason.
Oh, that's great. Yes. Akbar.
So I mean, it's essentially takes that three elements. We have to build the vehicle, we have to operate it, and then we have to fly it. So that's essentially the focus of our NASA is essentially to be able to do that efficiently and enable the U.S. global competitiveness. We want to be able to integrate the future vehicles, and we want to do it safely. And of course, that requires certain level of automation. So we have to develop the needed automation in order to do those three things. And that's my lightning round.
Terrific. Okay, Brian. Back to you.
I'll bring us home. So as it relates to eliminating climate impact, it's an and, not an or. I always get a question that relates to, is it this or is it that? It's always both. We're talking about transforming a massive system here. It's not any one technology or energy approach or whatever. It's really an and, not an or. And I guess the second thing I would say is, engineering in the past created the present that we have, and engineering now will create the future. And engineers get it done. So I'm a very proud engineer. I want everybody to be an engineer. But seriously, it's like this is the challenge of a generation, and engineers will be the ones that solve it.
Oh, I'm beaming. This is just terrific. So Imagine Aviation, thank you. All of this panel, thank you so much for your insights and what you brought to the table. So it's it's really just terrific. I mean, and so what we're going to see next, this isn't the end of this, what we're going to see next is a short video that's kind of leading the way towards sustainability. So we hope you enjoy what you see there. And again, just a huge thanks to all of you, the opportunity to be part of this. So thank you so much. John, Angela, back over to you.